Two retirees can start with the exact same amount saved, retire at the exact same age, and follow the exact same withdrawal rule, and one of them can safely spend more than double what the other one can. Not because they invested differently, not because one of them was smarter, because of 2 or 3 years of timing that neither of them had any control over. Research on retirement outcomes going back over a century shows the worst-timed retirees could safely withdraw about 4% of their savings a year. The best-timed retirees, retiring right before long bull markets, could safely withdraw 9%, 10%, even 11% from the exact same size portfolio using the exact same math. That's the gap nobody talks about when they argue about a single, safe number. Quick question before we get into it. If you had to guess your own safe withdrawal number right now, what would you say? Drop it in the comments because by the end of this video, you'll know exactly what actually decides it, and it isn't luck. And if you're new here, hit subscribe, because we're about to break down the real system behind that gap. Here's where the whole debate starts. In 1994, a financial planner named William Bengen ran the numbers on every 30-year retirement window in modern history, including retirees who started right before the Great Depression and right before the brutal inflation of the 1970s. He found one withdrawal rate that survived every single one of those worst-case windows without running out of money: 4%. That became the famous 4% rule. But here's the part that gets left out almost every time it's repeated. Bengen never said 4% was the right amount to spend. He said 4% was the amount that survived the single worst retirement conditions in the historical record. It was built to answer one narrow question. What's the highest rate that would have never failed, even in the worst year anyone ever retired into? Bengen himself has since revised his own number upward to 4.7% and said flatly that most retirees could have safely spent more than his original figure. Morningstar's most recent research puts the fixed safe rate for a 30-year retirement starting this year at 3.9%, but says retirees willing to adjust their spending as they go can push that closer to 5.7%. So, the 4% rule was never a ceiling, it was a floor, built for the worst case, and most people never experience the worst case. Here's why the higher numbers are so tempting. The stock market has historically averaged somewhere around 10% a year before inflation, so the pitch sounds airtight. If your money grows 10% and you only withdraw 7%, you're still coming out 3% ahead every single year. Your portfolio should grow forever. On $1 million, that's the difference between $40,000 a year and $70,000 a year. Nearly double the income, same nest egg. It's a genuinely convincing pitch, and in some decades, it would have actually worked. But it rests on one assumption that never holds up, that the market hands you that average return smoothly, in order, every year. It doesn't. The order those returns arrive in, not just the average, is the single biggest blind spot in retirement math. This is called sequence of returns risk, and it's the real reason two retirees with identical starting numbers can end up in completely different places. While you're still working, a market crash early on barely matters. You're buying in cheap, and you have decades to recover. But the moment you retire and start withdrawing, the order flips and starts to matter enormously. Picture a retiree with $500,000 who hits a 30% market drop in year one. Their portfolio is down to $350,000, but they still need their income, so they pull the same withdrawal anyway. That withdrawal, which was a reasonable percentage of the original balance, is now well over 10% of what's actually left. They're selling shares at the bottom, locking in a permanent loss, with fewer shares left over to recover when the market eventually turns around. A handful of bad years right at the start of retirement can sink a portfolio that the exact same average returns, arriving in a different order, would have left completely fine. If this is already making more sense than the just pick a number version of this argument you've probably seen online, do me a favor and hit that like button. It tells YouTube to put this in front of more people asking the same question. Because the actual fix for sequence risk isn't spending less forever out of fear, and it isn't gambling on a flat high number either. It's a specific 3-part system, and it's coming up next. The danger window in any retirement isn't the whole 30 years. It's roughly the first 5. That's the stretch where a bad sequence does the most damage, because there's no time yet for the portfolio to recover before withdrawals compound the loss. The fixed retirement researchers point to again and again is a cash buffer, typically 1 to 2 years of living expenses held outside the market, in cash or short-term bonds. When a downturn hits, you spend from that buffer instead of selling stocks at a loss, and you let the invested portion recover on its own timeline. This one move neutralizes most of the risk we just walked through, without requiring you to guess which years will be bad in advance. This is the piece that actually closes the gap between the worst-case retiree and the best-case one. Instead of locking in one withdrawal rate and never touching it for 30 years, researchers Jonathan Guyton and Guyton-Kitces studied a dynamic approach now generally called the Guardrails method. The mechanics are simple. You start at a somewhat higher rate than the ultra-conservative 4%, often in the 5% to 5.5% range. Then, you set an upper and lower guardrail. If the market performs well and your withdrawal rate drifts down below a certain point relative to your new, larger balance, you give yourself a raise. If a downturn pushes your withdrawal rate up past a certain point relative to your new, smaller balance, you trim back, usually by skipping that year's inflation adjustment rather than cutting deeply. Guyton and Kitces' research found this approach lets retirees start meaningfully higher than the rigid 4% rule, while matching or beating its historical success rate, because the plan actually responds to the market instead of ignoring it. So what actually determines whether you're closer to the 4% end of this spectrum or the 9% plus end? 4 things matter most. Your time horizon. A 40-year retirement needs a more conservative starting point than a 20-year one. Your income floor. The more of your essential expenses covered by Social Security or a pension, the more room your portfolio has to flex. Your spending flexibility. If you can genuinely trim discretionary spending in a bad year, you can safely start higher than someone whose budget is completely rigid. And the Guardrails system itself. Retirees who actually use it, rather than just picking a number and hoping, are the ones who end up spending closer to what their portfolio can actually support, instead of leaving money on the table out of fear, or running out of it from overconfidence. Put those 4 factors together, and you get very different real-world starting points from the exact same portfolio size. Someone retiring at 65 with a 20-year time horizon, most of their essential bills already covered by Social Security and a pension, and genuine willingness to trim a vacation in a down year, could reasonably use the Guardrails method to start closer to 6%. Someone retiring at 50 with a 40-plus year time horizon, no pension, and a fixed budget that can't flex at all, should stay much closer to that original 4% floor, because they have less room to recover from a bad early sequence and less flexibility to absorb one if it happens. Same research, same Guardrails system. 2 very different starting numbers, because the inputs were different. That's the whole point. There was never going to be one correct percentage for every retiree, because retirees aren't identical, even when their account balances are. So back to the 2 retirees from the start of this video. The one who could only safely spend 4%, and the one who could safely spend more than double that, weren't separated by skill or discipline. They were separated by market timing they never controlled, and by whether they had a system flexible enough to survive it. You can't choose what the market does in your first 5 years of retirement, but you can build the buffer, set the guardrails, and stop treating a single memorized percentage as the whole plan. That's the difference between hoping your money lasts and actually knowing it will. This is general education, not personalized financial advice. So run your own numbers, or a real one, against your actual situation before you lock in a withdrawal rate. If this helped you see the gap differently, tell me in the comments. Does your current plan use a fixed number or something closer to Guardrails? And if you want more breakdowns like this, the kind built on real research instead of round numbers people repeat without checking, hit subscribe, because that's exactly what this channel does every week.